Welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast, hosted by Dave Jenkins. The Equipping You in Grace podcast is a podcast about helping Christians develop a biblical worldview in a conversational tone about issues inside and outside the church. Now, for today's episode, let's join our host, Dave Jenkins.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host for the show. And with us today is our friend and returning guest, Nancy Pearcey. Nancy, welcome back to the show, ma'am.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's so good to have you. Can you, I think it's been maybe like 6 months or so. So can you catch us up on what's been happening in your life, marriage, ministry, and what are you working on ministry project-wise?
Well, it's been a big change because I have a new book out, and the book is called The Toxic War on Masculinity. And to my surprise, it's proven to be the most controversial book I've written. I really thought the book that we're talking about today, Love Thy Body, would be the most controversial because it does deal with issues like abortion and homosexuality and transgenderism and these really cutting edge issues. But ironically, at least in the Christian world, masculinity is a bigger trigger word. So, for example, I always do lots of reading groups on my books to rub off the rough edges. And when my reading groups would tell their friends and family that they were going through a manuscript on masculinity, the first question invariably was, whose side is she on? You know, like you have to be on someone's side. And by the way, men tended to assume that a woman writing a book on the subject would be a male-bashing feminist. And more progressive types tended to assume it was kind of a red pill, culture warrior, defensive men. So it's really been very interesting. Lots and lots of debates on Twitter, far more than I ever had for any other book. So since talking to you, that's the biggest thing that's changed is this new book and the incredible response that it's gotten.
Well, it's not only a good book; it's a book that's grounded in the Bible and it's grounded in good research. And so, I mean, they have to deal they have to deal with the substance of the argument, right? If they don't want to deal with the substance of the argument and just push back on a few points, then they're not reading it rightly and they're not reading it fairly. So, I would venture to say that that's probably most of the feedback that you probably gotten, right?
Oh, yeah. And there's always some people who hadn't read it because people who read it generally said, oh, this is interesting. It has a lot of things I didn't know. And I give, the history, the secular script for masculinity, for example. And people say, oh, I didn't realize that's where these ideas came from. People like Andrew Tate seem to have just appeared out of nowhere. No, there's a long history in terms of a more negative view of masculinity arising over time. So, and there was very surprising research done on Christian men too. I'll just give you the end line. The punchline is that according to scientific studies by sociologists, psychologists, Christian evangelical men test out as the most loving husbands and fathers, and that runs counter to the secular narrative as well. So that part of it surprised people. Perhaps more than, and me too. I mean, I was surprised. You and I have both all read the media narratives about Christian men. And so it was surprising to find out that the sociological data has completely debunked those negative narratives.
100% correct. Well, we've actually tried when this book, Love Thy Body, came out to actually record. And as we talked about last time when I had you on, that didn't work out. So we're trying again on this book. By the way, this is going to be, guys, part of our whole month, Nancy. We do a whole month. This is the second year in a row, trying to push back on the anti-LGBTQ agenda. So you're part of that conversation that we're having on the show this month. So tell us why you wrote this, Love Thy Body, why you wrote it, and how it's been received.
Yeah, so as you know, I teach apologetics at Houston Christian University. And so everything I do has something to do with apologetics. It has something to do with helping Christians to understand the secular mindset, the secular worldviews better, and to craft a Christian response. And what makes Love Thy Body unique is that most people try to deal with these issues one by one, right? So we try to master a good argument on this issue and that issue. But what Love Thy Body does is it shows that there's a common underlying secular worldview that connects all of them. And if you master that worldview, number one, it's a lot easier. And number two, it's a lot more effective. And so it deals with a secular worldview on a level that no other Christian book out there does. And it's because I think, if you get equipped to understand the secular world, everybody who's a communicator has heard the term, know your audience. So if we know our audience, we're going to do a better job of communicating.
Yeah, well, we both know that there's even a segment of what you just said of Christianity that would say, oh, no, you don't need to know the world at all. You just need to know your Bible. But I think it was even Martin Lloyd-Jones, who pretty much everybody respects, right? Who said, you need to know your world and then read your Bible and then read your newspaper, I think it was. So, I mean, you'd have a hard time arguing against that. But I think that is the heart behind what you're writing so well for this church. So that's good. And it's a fantastic, Love Thy Body is a fantastic book. I think you won at least one award for it, right?
Yeah, I think it was the Gospel Coalition. I'm not quite sure anymore. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's all right. It's a great book, and so is your book on the toxic war on masculinity. So I don't think I've ever read a book that wasn't good by you. So that's great.
Oh, thank you.
You say, you're welcome. You say that secular liberalism destroys human rights. Can you give us some examples of that, starting with abortion?
Yeah, so that's another surprising thing because, of course, the secular world advances abortion under the name of rights, right, the rights of women. But what secular bioethicists really argue is that the fetus, for starters, they acknowledge that the fetus is human. Most people don't realize that because, an everyday man on the street, it hasn't quite filtered down. But if you read professional bioethicists, they all agree that life begins at conception. The evidence from science, from DNA, from genetics is just too strong to deny it. But many of them are secular and they want to support abortion. And so how do they do that? Well, they say the fetus is human, genetically, physiologically, chromosomally, the fetus is human, but it's not a person until sometime later. So they divided up person from human. Again, in ordinary conversation, we don't do that. When we say a person is at the front door, we mean a human. But it started actually with the Roe v. Wade decision by the Supreme Court. They also said the fetus is human, but not a legal person. And therefore, because it's not a person, it does not warrant legal protection. And we don't have to protect it using our laws. It has no moral status. It's not part of what they call the moral community. That's what ethicists mean when they say, who are the people that we have a moral obligation to? They call that the moral community. And they said, the fetus doesn't belong there. And what they argue usually is that the fetus is human from conception, but it doesn't become a person until sometime later, which of course means these are two separate things. And so personhood tends to be defined in terms of a certain level of mental ability, cognitive functioning, self-awareness, and so on. And so only then does the fetus warrant any kind of legal protection. And so, but listen to what they're saying. They're actually saying being human is not enough for human rights because they're acknowledging the fetus is human, and yet they're saying it has no rights. And essentially that's what Roe v. Wade did, the Supreme Court decision. What it said is just being human doesn't give you any rights, which is a huge change in our understanding of human rights. It used to be anyone who was biologically human automatically had human rights. The right to life is the most fundamental of all because it means you have the right not to be killed. And so anyone who's a member of the human race had the right to life. But after Roe v. Wade, you could be a member of the human race and not have the right to life. And the court has essentially claimed arbitrarily that they have authority to decide which humans qualify as persons, qualify for human rights. So this is a much bigger issue than most of us have really quite figured out, because Roe v. Wade was 1973, and many of us still haven't figured out what that means. Is the whole notion of human rights has been changed so that now there can be people who are human but not persons. In fact, there's a label for it. They call it the human non-person. So that's a new category of being, right? It's the human non-person. And so that's why I argue that we have lost human rights, starting with abortion. And we need to figure out what those implications are, that the devastating political implications once people start really working it out.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm just thinking, man, we growing up in Seattle and living along the West Coast, which many people would say is the right coast. I would be among them. I think it's the right coast. Okay. But anyways, just lost everybody listening on the East Coast. Anyways, you can't help but just think about it as you're talking there. It just hits you that this is a religion, right? It's a religion. They are not just, celebrating an ideology or following an ideology. This is a matter for them of the secular left of worship. They have made that so clear, right? They go to rallies, they, get parade around, they stand, out and have massive gatherings, and it's a worship. They are worshiping this thing that they value above all things. So
yeah. So Robert George, who teaches at Princeton University and who is pro-life, has said that for liberals, abortion is a sacrament, that they will protect abortion above all else. And it is true. It's become sort of the center of the feminist movement. They don't fight for anything the way they fight for abortion. And I think what we have to do is realize there's a broader understanding of religion than what we usually use. Usually we think, it involves a personal God, it involves going to church, it involves praying. But there's a lot of things that a religion does that go beyond that. For example, what a religion does is it tells you what is the ultimate reality. What is the uncaused cause of everything else? Whatever you propose as the ultimate reality is your God. Because it functions in your worldview the same way that God functions in a theistic worldview, in a worldview that worships God, or any set of beliefs that tell you what is ultimate existence, what is human nature, and how should we live, an ethical system. And so I would say probably most people who accept abortion accept the notion that, well, probably at least among secular people, there'll be materialists. And so materialism is a worldview that says the ultimate reality is matter. In the beginning were the particles, and that everything is ultimately reducible to matter. And whatever is not reducible to matter is not even real. It's an illusion. You'll find this especially among scientists. Cognitive scientists, for example, all tell us that we're basically complex biochemical machines. Or I read one just the other day who said, we're all data processing machines, and that there's no free will, and that we're just a mechanism. Well, certainly they see the fetus that way. They see the fetus, even though they acknowledge the fetus as human. They say it's just a piece of matter, no different from any other piece of matter, no higher value or dignity or rights than just any other hunk of material, the material substrate, that we all live in is no different from any other material part of the material universe. So I think once we realize that worldviews or ideologies do function as religions, I totally agree with you. They do function the same way. And so we can call it a religion in that functional sense.
Yeah, that's really good, Nancy. You make the surprising claim in the book that a common thread links abortion and euthanasia to all the other moral issues, including homosexuality. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so we've covered abortion, and you saw that essentially the human being is split into two parts, right? If the fetus can be human at one stage, but not a person until sometime later. There's a kind of dualism there, a dichotomy, a division, where the human being now is made up of a body, of a biological substrate that has no particular value, and then this other thing called personhood, which is some sort of inner experience of yourself. And you can see how that is exactly what drives transgenderism, for example. Transgender activists argue explicitly that your body has nothing to do with your gender identity. That your biological sex does not determine whether you're a man or a woman. So, for example, BBC did a documentary in which they said, at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. And in that war, of course, it's the mind that wins. Or as another BBC video put it, it was for young people. And it featured a teenager who identified as non-binary. And she was obviously a girl. But she identified as non-binary, and she said, it doesn't matter what meat skeleton you've been born in. It's your mind, it's your feelings that define you. So there it was again. Your body has been demoted to a meat skeleton. It doesn't matter. It's not part of your authentic self. What matters is only your feelings. But there was a male to female transsexual who created a Kickstarter page for a video that was titled, I Am Not My Body. That says it all. I am not my body. It's not part of my authentic self. And this one's not in the book because it's more recent, but the Washington Post quoted a curriculum for first graders where teachers were told to tell their kids, just because you have what some people might call boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy. Notice what some people might call. Just because you have what some people might call girl parts doesn't mean you're a girl. So it's all the way down to kindergarten. It's all the way down to, the lowest levels that children are being indoctrinated with this worldview. And of course, I have to read the academic literature. So this was the first book that came out by a Princeton University professor defending transgenderism. And here's what she said. Well, what's interesting, at first she acknowledged that transgenderism involves self-division, self-alienation. And I thought, wait a minute, that sounds like a critique. But then she said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you're alienated from your body because, direct quote, what the physical body tells us is nothing. It has no meaning at all. So that is the core of what's being taught to young people down to kindergarten. Your body has no meaning at all. And that's the worldview, is that your body means nothing. It's a product of blind material forces, so it has no value or significance. The only thing that matters is your internal feeling, the sense of self. And so it's a very sharp dualism. And it does mean that we Christians have a wonderful opportunity to show that Christianity is a much higher view of the body than secular materialism does. We say your body has value and dignity because it's the handiwork of the Creator. You were created for a purpose. Your life doesn't. You do have meaning. That Princeton University professor was wrong when she said your body has no meaning at all. You see how Christians have a much more positive message that we can bring to people and say your body does have meaning. And, as Christians, what we want to do is help affirm the beauty and the dignity and the significance of your body. So that gives us a much better way of talking to non-Christians about these issues.
What you just demonstrated is what Lloyd Jones talked about. We talked about that earlier, about how he said, you need to read the Bible and then read the newspaper. And that's exactly, you just demonstrated that, right? So we need to know the arguments so that we can engage them and then bring the biblical worldview, like we've been talking about, to bear on these matters. And unfortunately, we know that when we do that, people say, well, you don't have any right to tell me what to do. And it's my response to that is always this. It has nothing to do, you're making this about me, right? We're talking about an objective standard of reality. It's not me that's doing it. It's actually the God who made you. He fashioned you in your mother's womb, Psalm 139, right? And he made you. And so he gets to tell you what to do because he's the one that gives you life and breath. So that's fundamentally different, making it about me and mine, which is what they want to do. Instead, we as Christians have to make it about what God has said and what God means. And then they can understand it. Even if they disagree, that's fine. But we just have to make that so crystal clear in this, overly psychologized, feelings-based, emotional culture. And emotions are important. Don't hear me say that they're not. But we have to make the objective standard of truth coming from God and His Word absolutely crystal clear in this culture, in this time, and especially on this topic.
Yeah. So it's also helpful, though, that we do have a positive way to approach people. See, Christians are known for having a negative message, right? It's wrong. It's a sin. It's against the Bible. Don't do it. And there's something wrong with you is what comes across a lot of times. And so what I do in my book is I show that we can, by focusing on the Christian view of the body, we can actually have a much more positive message. For example, I have lots of anecdotes, and one of my favorite is a young woman who lived as a lesbian for many years, then became a Christian, and to her own surprise, ended up marrying a man, and she now has 2 children. She wrote an article about it, and she said, the turning point came when I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason, and I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. And I love that because she didn't speak out of shame or guilt or condemnation. What changed her was I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. And so I have found, I get invited to speak about my book before public speaking, Christian seminaries, Christian universities, Christian schools. And I find that the hardest thing for Christians to get their mind around is how to do that, how to use positive language, how to say, honor my body, live in accord with the Creator's design, respect your biological sex, live in harmony or live in tune with who God made you to be. I'll give you another example. So I'm giving you examples now from homosexuality. And the other one is Sean Doherty. He's a young man who grew up exclusively attracted to other men. And his story is a little bit unusual because he grew up in a gay-affirming family and attended a gay-affirming church. So he did not think there was anything wrong with homosexuality. Critics will say, oh, if you change, you were just driven by shame and guilt and self-loathing. But he was not. And so the question then is, why did he change? And here's how he puts it. He says, I came to realize that God had made me physically for a sexual relationship with a woman. And this remained true, quite irrespective of whatever feelings I might have. And so he said, I didn't try to change my feelings, but what I did do is I came to accept my physical body, what I already had. I don't have to change my feelings. I just have to accept what I have. And that is, a male body as a good gift from God. He said, and then my feelings sort of naturally started to change. But you notice how he said, I accepted my body as a good gift from God. And that's the question at the core of this debate. It's, do we live in a cosmos operating by blind material causes, and therefore there is no particular purpose to your body? There is no intrinsic purpose that we're morally obligated to respect? Or do we have bodies that are a good gift from God? Do we live in a cosmos created by a loving Creator, and therefore it is intrinsically good? And so once again, what really won him over was a positive message. And that's what I'd like people to get out of my book is, yes, we can argue, and I do argue that it's, things like homosexuality are against Scripture. But in terms of how we address people, I think we need to start with the positive message. Schaeffer used to say this. Francis Schaeffer was an apologist, along with C.S. Lewis. Schaeffer and Lewis were the 2 greatest apologists of the 20th century. And Schaeffer used to argue that we tend to start our message with sin. You're a sinner. You need to get saved. And that's true. But it does tend to lead people to think, oh, the Bible says I'm worthless, that I'm corrupt and evil and broken and there's nothing good. And that's not what the Bible says. The Bible starts with creation. Schaeffer used to say the Bible does not start with the fall. The Bible starts with creation. You are made in God's image. And you do have beauty, wonder, and dignity because you're made in God's image. And that's where our message should start. It should start with a positive message that you're made in God's image and have great value. And not only, you have to address the fall. Here's how I put it. the fall is a bit like having a beautiful artistic masterpiece, and a child comes up with a magic marker. Beauty still shines through, and that's how we should communicate the view of Scripture on these, especially these issues of sexuality. That yes, there was a fall, but God's original beauty still shines through. So the fall is real, but it's a bit like an artistic masterpiece where a child takes a magic marker and scribbles on it. It's true that the masterpiece is defaced, but you can still see the original beauty shining through. And that's how we should look at God's creation, that the original beauty still shines through in spite of the fall. And when we talk to outsiders, that should be the first message is creation. I tell people, we tend to say, good news is salvation, but good news is creation too. That God created you, body and soul, soul and body, and that he calls us to love our body, to use the title of my book.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And there is a lot to be said about, making a more positive case for the faith and starting at what God made, and God saw that it was good. And so, obviously I agree with you. And it's pretty hard to argue against what Schaeffer said there. So, or Lewis. And it's a great point, because we can start at sin. So, and people can hear, and people do object, on the homosexual grounds and the transgender community. Well, all you do is you talk about sin. You don't talk about anything else. So we whack them. They feel that we whack them over the head. I've heard that many times. And like you said, we have to be careful that we do still talk about sin, but we can make a better case by starting, like you're saying, with creation, and then we do have to go to the fall, unfortunately, and because that takes us to Jesus, and that's the only way they can be saved. So, but I think you're right. We need to make a better presentation and include the creation, what God did and how God made people.
Let me give you another story. And again, this is so recent, it's not in my book, but it was a young woman who transitioned to male and successfully passed as a male for 10 years. And then she became a Christian, and her name's Laura Perry. And it was her story is kind of funny, because sanctification sometimes takes a while. She thought it was perfectly okay to continue living as a man after she became a Christian. And here's what she said. She said, I aspired to be a real man of God. And then she says, one day when I was praying, I seemed to hear God say to me, you cannot love me and yet reject my creation. And she knew what that meant. She meant, you can't love me and reject your body, because that's my creation. And so today she is living as a woman. But I thought that was such a good story, because what it's saying is our calling is to love God and love his creation. And again, that message is what worked for her in understanding that she should live according to the way God had created her.
So, you've committed a large part of your life to the university and to teaching students. So what would you say to fellow teachers and professors and those whether at the university level, college, or, high school, elementary level, they're in the middle of this issue with homosexuality and increasingly transgenderism. What advice and encouragement do you have for them?
Yeah, so I really think it's important to address these issues at the worldview level, because most people, I think, when we talk about people, sort of Christians, getting sort of trapped in the negative message and giving the impression of, whacking people over the head, it's because we tend to just rely on quoting the Bible. And I think that quoting the Bible is a good thing. But there's a translation process. Yeah, I may as well quote Schaeffer again, because he says, we're all missionaries, and we all have to learn the language of the people that we're addressing. Even if they speak English, he said there's a worldview gap. They may speak English, but they mean something different by a lot of their words, right? So there's a worldview gap. And in fact, you said it at the beginning of the interview when you said we have an obligation to learn their language. So a big part of my teaching is, okay, guys, let's learn the secular language so that you can speak more effectively. You know, if you're a missionary, it's not their job to learn your language. It's your job to learn theirs. It's our obligation. And so that's why I'm so big on helping people to understand the secular worldview that's driving these issues from abortion to homosexuality, transgenderism. And in fact, let me give you one more story that just came to mind, because even secular people get it. This interview came out shortly after my book. So it's another one that's not in the book. But it was a 14-year-old girl from a very secular family. And she had transitioned to male at age 11. She had lived for 3 years as a trans boy and then had recovered her identity as a girl. And in this interview, she says, the turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body. And I thought, what a great interview that would have been for a book titled Love Thy Body. And so I tell that story to say, look, secular people understand. They're picking up on this as well. You sometimes see on secular websites, transgenderism is body hatred. That's a term you're seeing these days. It's body hatred. So the idea of addressing non-Christians through their own worldview is working, is kind of what I'm saying. You know, helping them to see that transgenderism involves a denigration, a denial, a rejection of the body. That message is actually starting to get out. And so that should encourage us that this is actually working. You know, moral messages don't always work when they're stripped of on websites these days. You will sometimes see even secular people saying transgenderism represents body hatred. And so the message is getting out there that transgenderism involves the rejection, a denigration, a denial of the body. And so that message is getting through, and Christians, it's a great opportunity for Christians to be able to communicate that the Bible has a very high view of the material world, including our physical bodies.
Yeah, and that is such a good encouragement because, you know, I think for some Christians, they think, well, is speaking up about this, does it really matter? And is it making a difference? And we need to hear, one, that we need to keep speaking, and two, we need to keep learning how to speak effectively to it. And, you know, the first thing, the desire, we can, like we were talking about earlier, we can browbeat people over the head. And if we don't send a positive message, they won't be able to hear about their sin. And we should be concerned about that. But we should also keep learning and keep educating ourselves, because this is, especially with transgenderism, that's a problem that's not going away anytime soon. And if we don't keep speaking up about that, my concern is that there's other things on the horizon and they're already coming. And so we better be getting armed now if you're not. And so that's why, you know, I have started doing this, for lack of a better way to say, anti-LGBTQ plus thing. It isn't because I'm against them as people, but I'm against like we were talking about, the worldview behind the ideology that they're, you know, espousing. And my desire is to see people equipped and from a biblical worldview to A, become more knowledgeable about the issues, and two, how do they speak about it? So,
yeah, and one reason that Christians have not been more effective is because we tend to have a kind of a similar division. You know, we call it the sacred secular split, and we tend to see the body sort of in the secular realm and the spirit in the sacred realm. Or as one of my students put it, growing up in the church, I was always taught body bad, spirit good. And so we tend to have that, and we need to recover our own heritage, because the early church was born into a culture that denigrated the body and the material world for very different reasons. Like back then, it was more things like Platonism and Gnosticism. A lot of you probably know what Gnosticism is, just because much of the New Testament was written against Gnosticism. And Augustine was a Manichae. So all of these isms in the New Testament times did treat this world as the realm of death, decay, and destruction. And they actually talked about the body as the prison of the soul and said that salvation was escaping from that prison. And they also said that Gnosticism said, this world is so evil that it must have been created by an evil God. You know, they had several levels of deities, and it was the lowest deity who created this world. And so in the New Testament times, Christianity was absolutely revolutionary because it said that this universe was not created by an evil God, but by the supreme deity who is a good God. And therefore, it's intrinsically good. As you put earlier, Genesis says over and over again, God saw that it was good. And the real scandal, however, in the first century was the incarnation. The idea that that same supreme deity had entered into the material world and taken on a physical body. And so that the incarnation is the ultimate affirmation of the dignity and worth of the human body. And then when Jesus was executed on a Roman cross, we might say he did escape the body, the prison of the body, as Gnosticism said. But what did he do then? He came back in a physical, bodily resurrection. To the ancient Greeks, this was not spiritual progress. You know, they literally did argue at the time, why would anyone want to come back to the realm of the body? And of course, at the end of time, what's God going to do? He's not going to scrap the material world as if he made a mistake the first time around. He's going to renew it and restore it. Well, the scripture says it's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. And you and I will be there in restored bodies. From the very beginning, the Apostles' Creed has affirmed the resurrection of the body. This is a stunningly high view of the physical world. There's nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy. And so we should be utterly excited and happy and enthusiastic when we communicate the Christian worldview to other people, because what we have is so positive and so affirming that and people don't know that. They think, oh, Christianity teaches sin, therefore it has a low view of human dignity. No. The only reason sin is such a tragedy is because humans have such value. You know, if a little plastic trinket breaks, you throw it away, no big deal. But if a classic artistic masterpiece is broken, that's a tragedy. And so that's why sin is a tragedy. It's only because we are God's masterpieces, and we do have the value of being, you know, the highlight of God's creation. And so that's how we should be able to communicate it with people.
That's really, really good. Well, Nancy, where can people go to find out more about you on social media or otherwise?
Yeah, so my publisher very generously updated my website so that it's colorful and fun. So come on over to nancypearcey.com. Don't forget the extra E, Pearcey, nancypearcey.com. You can browse my other books. You can leave a message, which I always enjoy. I enjoy reading people's messages when they say hello. So come over to nancypearcey.com and say hi.
Well, Nancy, yes, I encourage you to go check out Nancy's work and her other books. They're all great. You know, there's a lot that we could really talk about Love Thy Body. And just as we wrap up this conversation today, can you give us a few takeaways?
We have really covered it pretty well. So let me think about that. I guess I like what you said a few minutes ago when you said it's not going to stop here. You know, what's the next step? I think the next step is transhumanism. There are people out there today. Martin Rothblatt is one. His name was Martin, and he transitioned to female. So he called himself Martin. He invented Sirius XM radio. So he's a mega millionaire. He puts a lot of money into advancing transgenderism, you know, creating clinics and educational materials and so on. And he has specifically said transgenderism is the stepping stone to transhumanism. You know, people who are willing to say, you know, my biology doesn't matter, you know, being male or female doesn't really matter. are the ones who are going to say, oh, maybe we can even transcend biology. Maybe we can move beyond being biologically human. What transhumanism says is, since humans are a product of evolution, that's their assumption, therefore, we're going to be evolving to the next stage of evolution. So why not help it along? Why not use AI, artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and so on to create the next stage of evolution? And it's an extreme denigration of the body, because what they say, another spokesman is Ray Kurzweil, who is the director of engineering for Google. So these are all prominent people. And he has basically said that human species, when we talk about being human, that's a biological term. What we're doing, direct quote, what we're doing is transcending biology. And so transhumanism expresses the next step in saying, we can transcend human biology. Human biology has no particular meaning or dignity or, it's not something we need to preserve. We are transcending human biology. So you are absolutely right. This is the next step, and we need to be ready for it, because it's going to be the ultimate denigration of the body, especially the people who want to say, hey, we can transfer our minds to a computer disk, right? We'll have everlasting life on a computer disk, and we won't need our bodies at all. So that's the kind of language that you hear now among transhumanists, and we need to get ready.
So basically you're saying we'll be like the movie iRobot. We'll be able to be downloaded and then put into robotic bodies, and then I guess, well, that'll be a sick and twisted and perverted version of quote unquote heaven, right?
Yes. That's a good analogy. iRobot shows us the artists always anticipate where we're going. So the people who produced iRobot foresaw. Do you remember what they said back then in the movie? Frequently they said there might be a ghost in this machine. And that was a phrase they took from the philosopher Descartes. Descartes in the 1600s was already saying the human being is just a ghost in a machine. He's got a spirit, and that's what counts. His body is just a machine. It has no particular dignity. Already, people were saying that non-Christian, well, he did claim to be a Christian, so, but he had a non-Christian worldview, which can happen, right? You can be a Christian and have a non-Christian worldview. So Descartes was already saying, human beings are just a ghost in the machine, and they can, use their minds to change, to control, to treat their body as sort of like a car that will go wherever you want it to go. That's all it is. It's just, it's just a mechanism that the mind can use. So iRobot was using that phrase from Descartes and said, the robot that we're talking about today is what Descartes was talking about, the ghost in the machine. Your body is just a machine, so why not be free from it?
Yeah, that's so good. Well, Nancy, we so appreciate your time. Thank you for the great books that you've written. Love Thy Body, The Toxic War on Masculinity, both great books. Go visit her website and check out the rest of her work. Thank you so much, Nancy, for your time today and for joining us.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, it is fun talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, rate us on the app, and share this with your friends and family on social media. If you want to find us on social media, you can find us on Twitter @Servants of Grace, on Instagram @Servants of Grace, or by searching @Servants of Grace on Facebook. You can also find this episode and many others like it on the front page of our website, servantsofgrace.org.